Even the most level-headed among us can be prone to the occasional superstition. We touch wood for luck. We step into a busy road rather than walk under a ladder. And we get that slightly uneasy feeling on Friday the 13th. All very mild compared to the story we tell tonight of the terrible curse which some believe lay in wait for over 3,000 years. Is it all fevered imagination? Or has it left too many tragic events in its wake to write off as coincidence?
Egypt is home to one of the Earth's most ancient civilizations. Surrounded by thousands of miles of desert sands, its lifeblood is the River Nile. The priceless treasures of King Tutankhamun. Filling his tomb and antechambers are objects of breathtaking beauty. The ancient Egyptians believed Tutankhamun would take them with him to the next world. But when they left these artifacts behind, did they also leave something darker? Something which would strike at those who dared to disturb what rightfully belonged to their king. It is 1922, and for more than 30 centuries, no one has set foot into this secret place hidden below the sun-baked, inhospitable desert in the Valley of the Kings. But the sands of time are running out. Thousands of miles away in Hampshire is Highclere Castle, family seat of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. His meeting with Egyptologist Howard Carter will quite simply make history.
£1,000 and we don't have anything to show for it.
But my lord, the tomb is there. And now we know where we should be concentrating our excavations. My lord, I believe the area will prove most fruitful.
But one cannot go on searching forever. I cannot fund some impossible gamble.
But my lord, think of the prize. And think how you would feel should it be another who makes the discovery, which you now most surely have earned. If you would permit Mr. Bethel to show you the search area more precisely.
The Valley of the Kings.
Yes, my lord. The East Valley.
Very well, Carter, you have one more chance.
My grandfather didn't suffer fools gladly. He was interested always in archaeology in this country. I think it was finding bits and pieces of funeral artifacts from Tutankhamun's grandfather that encouraged Carter to advise my grandfather that there were still one place which had never been dug at all.
So in October, November 1922, they agree to have one final go at it. If it doesn't work this time, we'll never look again. The rest is history.
I can only guess, but I imagine my grandfather was very excited when he received the telegram.
From Carter.
At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations, Howard Carter.
We found it.
It was the most important find in the history of archaeology, in my view. The most complete pharaonic tomb that had ever been discovered. A bit like the moonshot, you know, in the 1960s. It had that sort of media attention. Carnarvon, in common with a lot of the aristocracy in the 1920s, who'd come out of the First World War, was very interested in spiritualism and in the occult. Upstairs in the East Anglia bedroom, there were said to be sort of seances and table rapping and that sort of stuff.
It was here, during a séance, that Lord Carnarvon was warned that should he go into the tomb, he would be in grave danger. There was another supposed warning to Lord Carnarvon and the rest of the expedition when a famous novelist of the time, Marie Corelli, wrote to the Times in March 1923, claiming that the most dire punishment follows any rash intruder into a sealed tomb.
Finish! Finish! But whatever the danger, no one would jib at this adventure. And what an adventure! A challenge to the psychic powers of the ages.
Lord Carnarvon's 20-year-long quest finally ended on February the 17th, 1923, when he and Carter found themselves at the entrance to the burial chamber itself.
This is what we've been working for. Yes!
If he goes down in that spirit, I give him 6 weeks to live.
Arthur Weigel was an ex-Egyptologist employed by the Daily Mail. So he started producing various stories, amongst which the story that Carnarvon went into the tomb with a broad grin on his face, and Weigel said, if he has that attitude, I doubt whether he'll last 6 weeks.
Oh, this is what we've been working for. Yes, yes, yes! Hello? Can you see anything? Wonderful things.
And when they realised the seals weren't broken, the doors of the shrine were sealed with Tut's seal. That was the moment they knew there was something inside. Carnarvon must have been fantastically excited. Almost blew a fuse.
Oh, my Lord.
When the news of the dig reached the papers, and it was the first peacetime mass media event of the 20th century, someone wrote to the papers and said that when Carter first found the tomb, there was a curse in hieroglyphics. Fabulous stuff.
Death comes on swift wings to he who disturbs the Pharaoh's rest.
There's no doubt there was a curse on nearly all the pharaohs' tombs. As far as this particular tomb was concerned, it would have been the same.
Carter had a pet canary in the Valley of the Kings, and the day the tomb was opened, a cobra got into his house and somehow managed to get into the cage, and the poor canary was eaten.
After the opening of the burial chamber, Carnarvon suffered a mosquito bite, which at the time seemed nothing more than a minor irritation.
It was said by some that Carnarvon was bitten on the left cheek at the exact spot where there's an indentation on the cheek of the boy King Tut.
Lord Carnarvon thought nothing more of the bite until some days later.
At some stage, my grandfather, he cut himself shaving, cut the mosquito bite, and it became infected, and he got septicemia.
And his temperature starts going up. It's about 102, 104 by this stage. He's getting feverish.
My father heard of my grandfather being very unwell as a soldier in India in the 7th Hussars, and he got permission to travel as fast as possible.
Do you remember how those Italians ran like rabbits in Piave?
Oh, yes, dear Papa, they did. They did.
We should have shelled them and shot them like rabbits.
Yes, I'm sure you're right.
And immediately, of course, all hell breaks loose. Various things happen simultaneously.
Papa.
The strangest thing of the lot was the lights going out in Cairo at the time my grandfather died. There was no answer to it, and therefore it's still a mystery, unsolved. My grandfather's Jack Russell, which he'd taken with him on all his other visits, and this time he'd left here at Highclere. At the same time, allowing for time change, let out a howl in the housekeeper's room and died.
Was it King Tutankhamun announcing his revenge? I think the incident with the dog is suggestive, because of course the Egyptians worshipped a god in the form of a dog, Anubis, the jackal god, and Anubis was a god of embalming, and he was also a god that guarded the corpse. There's a magnificent statue of Anubis that was found in the tomb. Isn't it a strange coincidence that a dog dies at the same time as Lord Carnarvon, when there's a dog in the tomb of Tutankhamun keeping guard?
Lord Carnarvon was laid to rest here at Beacon Hill, overlooking his beloved Highclere Castle, and his Jack Russell Terrier was buried with him. The 5th Earl's son never went into the tomb and was reported as saying that he would not accept £1 million to do so. The current Lord Carnarvon has also stayed well away, despite several invitations.
If the evil curse really exists, surely there'd be more victims. After all, Lord Carnarvon wasn't the only person responsible for raiding King Tutankhamun's treasure. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb was the most significant find in archaeological history. But there were those who believed that an ancient curse would strike at those responsible for raiding its treasures.
After the death of Lord Carnarvon, worldwide attention focused on the curse. Even the normally restrained Times blamed the ancient Egyptian god of death, Osiris. Meanwhile, it seemed more victims were being claimed.
There was a young man by the name of Richard Bethel. Now, he was a protege of Carnarvon's. He was secretary to the expedition, worked very closely with Carter. He was the son of Lord Westbury. Many of the artefacts from this tomb and others ended up in his house. Now, his house was the scene of unexplained bangs, fires were started. A family servant later says that he started the fires because he was freaked out by the atmosphere.
In November 1929, Richard Bethel, apparently a fit and healthy 46-year-old, was relaxing at his London club when he had a sudden seizure.
Bethel himself is found dead in a chair in a club for no apparent reason. Lord Westbury was very upset by his son's death, obviously, and he attributed it to the curse. He committed suicide, he wasn't killed by a mummy, but something got to him very badly, and we just don't know quite how.
Lord Westbury jumped to his death.
On the way to Lord Westbury's funeral, the hearse runs over a small boy who is also killed. He had nothing to do with the expedition, but he was linked to it by this chain of causality and this chain of tragedy.
If the curse really existed, wouldn't it also have hit Howard Carter? After all, he'd actually discovered the tomb. He, in fact, lived on for many healthy and happy years and died a natural death.
Now, of course, one of the main things that the skeptics always say when you bring up the subject of the curse is, oh, well, Carter was in charge of the expedition. He lived until 1939 for another 16 years. But I don't think he came off scot-free. He did not have the sort of career of success and professional esteem that you would expect from someone who had made the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Very few people turned up to his funeral. He was buried in a very small grave. Just because a dog doesn't bite everybody, it doesn't say it doesn't bite somebody. One coincidence, fine. Two coincidences, fine. But what we have in this case is a whole group of different sets of coincidences that all seem to cluster around this one tomb and this one excavation. And then, of course, Lord Carnarvon's family was struck by tragedy as well. His half-brother, Aubrey, died in a fit of insanity. His half-sister was bitten, rather coincidentally, by an insect, and that became infected, and she died. And then there was Lady Carnarvon, Almina, who was a Rothschild's heiress, a rich woman, you would think. But she dies penniless in a bedsitter.
Numerous film and television companies have made dramas and documentaries about King Tutankhamun. Almost all have been riddled with disaster.
If somebody offered me £1 million, I would not go back to Egypt ever again. There was too many things going wrong, and it was really freaky. Everything went wrong.
Trevor Smith trains animals for film productions around the world, including a drama shot this year set around the Tutankhamun story.
Everything went wrong it possibly could do. We had to take some Saker falcons and fly them in the desert. And even on the day, they took 3 days finding the location. And on the day, my man went violently sick, so we couldn't film there. When we eventually did find a location, terrific sandstorms blew up and we couldn't film. So at the end of the day, it was just a total nightmare.
Even Professor Christopher Frayling, who is sceptical about the curse, suffered a series of bizarre events which he finds difficult to explain away.
When we were filming The Face of Tutankhamun in spring '92, one or two things happened while we were filming that were quite strange. Well, I was standing over the sarcophagus in the tomb and talking all about the curse, actually. And just as I started talking, all the lights went out. A famous international hotel in Cairo. I got into the lift on the 26th floor with the producer, and there was a loud crack, followed by swish, 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 and we started shooting down the lift shaft. And some sort of braking system was pushing outwards, and eventually it got stuck, lodged in the shaft, just below the lower basement. And I realized at that moment we had fallen down the lift shaft. I didn't look up to see if King Tut was there with a hacksaw, and I threw up, actually, all over the car. I suddenly realized, Christ, I've nearly died.
Peter Graham Scott was the producer of The Curse of King Tutankhamun's Tomb, a film which was supposed to star Ian McShane and was made in 1979 and 80 as part of a lavish co-production to be shown in America.
When we started filming, we had some very simple shots to do of Ian McShane as Carter. We were going to do a shot where he drives up. He was pressing the accelerator instead of the brake. It shot him over the cliff. The car hit the ground and he trapped his leg and it broke pretty badly. But then we had the terrible problem of who is going to play the lead, because Ian was going to be out of action for 4 months. It might well have been something connected with the fact you should not disturb the dead.
Here at St Mark's Graveyard in the Oxfordshire village of Blackburton are buried 2 members from 99 Squadron based at RAF Bryce Norton. It was their job to fly Tutankhamun's treasures to an exhibition at the British Museum in London.
In January 1972, I was the loadmaster on a flight from Bryce Norton to Cairo to collect the relics of Tutankhamun.
I was the senior technical officer of the trip. The captain held a secret envelope and was told to open it up at a certain time over the Mediterranean.
Pick up Tutankhamun artifacts, as detailed below from Cairo Airport. Maintain absolute security at all times.
I was the co-pilot. My memory of the load was a pile of tea chests sitting on the ground outside the aircraft with one solitary Egyptian soldier sitting on top of them with a .303 rifle and a cigarette in his mouth. Didn't seem all that important.
The value of the cargo we had on board this time was certainly the greatest that I've ever had on board. At 150 to 200 million pounds, you'd have to go a long way to beat it.
There was a few cryptic remarks, of course, about the curse, which was bound to happen, but nobody really kind of took any serious.
The relics on board included Tutankhamun's 22-carat gold death mask and his coffin.
4 or 5 of us were playing cards, and the reason we played cards, because we were totally bored. That was all it was. And we lost the fact that we were sat on the gold mask. That had no longer any relevance anymore. It was a box for us to play cards on. We all stood up, had enough, and that's when I stood up and kicked the box and said a stupid childish remark.
I've just kicked the most expensive thing in the world.
I do remember kicking the box with my left foot. And of course, a couple of years later, I fell to the ground. Cursed myself for doing it, and I happened to look down to pick myself up, and I noticed that my left foot was turned round facing me. The next day I found out that I had, in actual fact, broken 37 bones.
It was the same leg with which Ian had kicked the crate containing the death mask.
But the RAF medical people have surveyed me again, and I've got an 80% disability due to the injury alone. The future isn't exactly rosy for me, but at least I'm still around.
Crew member Jim Webb's house was destroyed by fire, and Captain Rick Lorry died a year later. Also on board was Ian Lansdowne's best pal in the RAF, flight engineer Ken Parkinson.
Ken was a very good friend of mine, and he died Friday the 13th of August 1978. Ken and myself were probably the closest friend I've ever had in my life. He was quite a fit man. He played rugby for the Air Force. Ken and Rick were in their early 40s. So naturally, we were all surprised to hear two comparatively healthy people, both play sport very heavily, die so early. I think people begin to realize there is a possibility that there could be a curse, purely because of the number of people who've been involved in it.
Archaeologists are still searching for other tombs in the Egyptian valleys. Bearing in mind the experiences of those who've come into contact with Tutankhamun's tomb, perhaps it would be wiser to leave the pharaoh's rest undisturbed.
Just for the record, shortly after we began production on this particular programme, our researcher was struck down by a sudden and inexplicable illness. It was the first time he'd had to see a doctor in 20 years. All he needed was to take a few pills and keep away from ancient tombs. I think I'll go home now. Good night.